Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and I thank you for this opportunity. As I was thinking about what I'm going to talk about for this piece of legislation that's 30 years old, I could probably spend the entire day talking about what the impact has been or hasn't been, and I really don't have that kind of time, so I'm going to give you just a very broad perspective of what this law has done, and then to talk a little bit about where we go from here. So that's me in the middle. My name is Ginger Potter. I am the Senior Environmental Education Specialist with the Office of Environmental Education, which is part of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And somebody told me that they thought I was probably the senior environmental education person in the federal government, which means I've been doing this for a very long time, and this is something I really, really believe in. So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about, a little bit about this, an overview of what the Act is. I want to talk about the accomplishments, and I'm not going to talk about the entire Act, but those sections that we have had the most success in. To talk about the limitations and the challenges of this law, and then to talk about what would the next one look like. So let me get all of my notes here. So here we are, the National Environmental Education Act. It is 30 years old next year. It is, in fact, the second National Environmental Education Act we've had in the United States. The first one was done in 1970, and it was very much a part of that sort of revolution of the 60s and the 70s where people were really beginning to understand how important the environment was to health and safety of people in the country. This is about the time when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, talking about pesticides. So it was a really big movement, and that first National Environmental Education Act was a reflection of that, of the people being very interested in where we were going as a country. The Act has accomplished a great deal. In 30 years, we've spent approximately $200 million US, which on the surface sounds like it's a lot of money, but that's $200 million over 30 years. So it actually is not a great deal of money. However, for most of that time, the law was the largest single funding source for environmental education in the United States. It is still one of the highest sources of funding for environmental education. It has never been more than $10 million a year. It has, in fact, expired. The law expired in 1996. The reason it still exists is that within our system of governance, Congress is the body in the government that are the guys with the checkbooks, the guys with the money. So even if your law has expired, if Congress decides, well, we want you to keep doing this, so we're going to give you money every year, that's how we have been operating since 1996. Congress continues to give us money, and we continue to do the programs mandated by the law. We're not doing everything in the law. Oops, wrong thing. These are this is the entire list of requirements for the Act. We have an educator training program, we have a grant program, we're supposed to do internships for students, fellowships for teachers, fellowships for students, internships for teachers. We have several award programs, we have an advisory council at the highest level, we have a task force at the federal level or ministry level, and we also have a foundation. These are what we are required to do. What we are currently doing are the educator training program, the grant program, a couple of the award programs, the advisory program, and the foundation. To give you an idea of one of the issues with the law is that it is very prescriptive in nature. So that this is the money we have. 25% has to go for the educator training program. 25% has to go to the operation of the office. 10% to the training foundation, 2% of the awards, and 38% for the grant program. We cannot deviate from these numbers at all. 38% of our money, whatever we get that year, must go to grants, and the same for everything else. As you can imagine, that's a little difficult to do sometimes, especially when you see that there are opportunities out there to maybe do something a little different, and that doesn't allow you to do that. So I'm actually only going to talk about the two biggest programs, the 63% of the budget, which are the Educator training program and the grant program. When we talk about training here, we're talking about training educators, training teachers. We do not train environmental professionals. That's not what this is. This is not where we focus. We require that all the grants that are given have a stewardship component, where the students or the adults, whoever the grant is focusing on, that they are actually going out and doing something, so they understand what it means to work out in the environment. All the grants are required to address at least one of the strategic goals that the Environmental Protection Agency has. Last administration, they were very clear: clean air, clean water, strong and resilient communities. They're a little difficult to understand for the second round. Things like cooperative federalism, which is basically the ministry level working with state level government. And all of them must address at least one education priority, things like capacity building, training, career development. So by the numbers, this is how many grants have been given out in those almost 30 years. That's totaling $76 million. Again, sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. The grants have gone anywhere from $1,000 to $250,000. That is the cap. We cannot give any grants above $250,000. Another interesting point with this is that with the grant, the grantee, the applicant, is required to do a 25% match, which means we've actually done a little bit more than $76 million with the grant. We look at that match as a way to show the commitment by the applicant that this is something they really want to do, and that they're hoping to continue to do this in the future once their grant funding disappears. This program is actually the most competitive program in EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and it is the one that has served as a model for other competitive grant programs in the agency. We've given out grants from $1,000 to $250,000. Let me show you sort of what that looks like. In the early years, we gave out an awful lot of grants, and as time has gone on, we've gone much smaller grants. These were where you had the $1,000 or $5,000. There is actually a requirement in the law that says 25% of the grants that you give out every year have to be for $5,000 or less. Back in 1995, $5,000 or less was actually pretty doable. Go up to 2019 and not so much. So we've now turned that into a sub-award program. As you would guess, since most of environmental education in the United States happens at the out-of-school NGO world, most of the money has gone to NGOs. A little bit in the college and universities, and the school districts or schools. We can't give them to individual schools, but we can give grants to school districts. As you also might guess, water is the one that most grants are about, water literacy and biodiversity, because those are the easier ones to do. It's very easy for a lot of students to get out into from the classroom into the schoolyard and work on issues, or for a community on the weekend to do things like cleanup around their community water sources. So this pesticides and soil agriculture, that's something that's come up pretty recently. This new administration is very much about rural communities and agriculture and food waste. So we have a lot of grants that are sort of moving into that food waste arena. How do you stop having food waste in your community or in your school? So this is actually our website. You can actually get into our website and look at a description of every single grant that we've ever given. All 50 states, all territories have gotten grants. And they will give you an idea of what kind of the variety of audiences and topics and everything that we're doing. And I just wanted to share with you a program to give you an idea of one of the grants. I was actually the project officer on this grant called the STRAW program, Students and Teachers Working to Restore a Watershed. It's in Marin County, which is a little south of San Francisco. And this is an area where it has creeks and rivers running through the entire county. And you have everybody from farmers and cattle ranchers, dairy farms, wineries, all of these located in the same area. Well, it was really interesting to start talking to these farmers and ranchers and making them understand that whatever you're doing on your property is actually affecting what's happening in somebody else's property. So the idea was to get people to be more aware of things like putting pesticides out. You don't put pesticides out the day it's going to rain because it's just going to wash off and it's going to affect the water quality all the way down the stream or the river. And what these guys started to do is take willow trees and they built what's called willow walls. And they would put these up on the sides of these, on the banks of all these creeks and these rivers to help stop the runoff from the pesticides in all of these areas. And that became so successful that not only were you stopping this kind of runoff, but you were actually introducing species back into those areas that hadn't been there for 20 or 30 years. So the willow walls that are now 20 plus years old, you see this huge diversity of little creatures coming back, and foxes and birds and everything that's been missing just because these guys decided that they really wanted to do something for this community. And it is still going on. I believe it's almost 30 years old. This is the kind of work that our grants are actually doing. So the Educator training program, that's 25% of our budget. That's actually my program. I am the manager of that program. We do this as a 5-year cooperative agreement because we are actually in partnership with the principal investigator, whoever that organization is. So it's a true partnership of working together. And we do these where what we want is for the next iteration to build on the previous iteration so that everything is building the capacity of the entire education, teachers, educators, non-formal educator community. These are the required functions. This is actually in the law, one of the most prescriptive sections of the law. Each iteration has to do something in these topic areas, not necessarily the same thing, but this is what all of them have to do. Oops. No. We'll go. Anyway. Sorry, technical difficulties. Oh, there we go. So here's the time. Here's from the beginning. University of Michigan did the first one. The Environmental Education Training Partnership, or ETAP, as we like to call it, 1, 2, 3, was either University of Wisconsin Stevens Point or the North American Association for Environmental Education, NAAE. EE capacity is the one that was done by Cornell University, and we are currently in EE 360. The EE 360 is the actual current program that we're doing. This is a group of folks who are actually community fellows. They're working within their own communities to do a variety of programs for the entire year, and they continue to get funding, small grants for the projects that they are working on. They are also required to get the majority of their funding from fundraising in their communities. To look at the teacher training program or educator training program from the beginning was actually kind of daunting because there's so many things that have happened under that program. This is a listing of the things I think are probably the most impactful. The EE toolbox. So if a teacher wants to develop a workshop to train other teachers that train the trainer, that tells you how to do it. EE Link was one of the first resources, electronic resources in environmental education in the world. The guidelines for excellence, back in the early 90s, there was a lot of criticism of environmental educators and the materials they were using in schools. And while it was very hard to hear, it was also allowed people to step back and think, well, is this material really non-biased? Are we really teaching people how to think, or are we trying to tell them what to think? So the idea of coming up with standards or guidelines for excellence was revolutionary in EE in the United States. And again, this is part of the educator training program. So it wasn't just about teaching people, teaching educators. It was also about fundamentally improving the field of environmental education. We have diversity handbook, conservation toolkit, how do you introduce conservation activities to communities. The EE Pro is probably, I'm going to say, the source for environmental education, anything in the United States. It is, if you want to learn anything about environmental education, that's where you go. If you're looking for materials or resources, that's where you go. If you want to do a webinar, that's where you go. It also is a platform for environmental educators to exchange ideas, and that has become global. That is now something that's open to anybody in the world who's interested in environmental education and is looking for something, how to do better, how to train, how to teach better. The community fellows I just talked to you about. The climate change fellows was the initial, I know we're not supposed to be talking about climate change, but that was the initial program. And again, these were people who are doing projects within their communities to help their communities become more resilient. And there's online courses, webinars, just hundreds of online courses and webinars. So this program has fundamentally changed the way we do environmental education in our country. So to stop and think about what kind of impact this law has had, I firmly believe that we would not have gotten where we are in environmental education in our country without this law. Without this, there was really no thread that kept anything in any state moving together. There was nothing to concentrate the efforts that people were doing. This was the first opportunity that people saw where you could see building, you were going to start building and building and building on what had happened. And it was a way to really open people's eyes to the field of environmental education and what could be achieved with environmental education. Again, talking about the teacher training program, this was about professionalizing the field. In the United States, we have this concept of a master teacher, someone who has higher skill set, more education, is almost revered as an educator. That's the kind of thing that this law has allowed us to do. We have a professional association like the Korean Society for Environmental Education. Ours is the North American Association for Environmental Education, or NAAE, as we call it. And because of this law, that professional association has really grown, strengthened and grown, and is really a source for all kinds of information. And these are the folks that in the country who are doing environmental education at the ground level, at the state level, national, and even at the global level. Thousands and thousands of people have learned about the environment. We have all these grants. These grants are reaching out to the communities, reaching out to students, reaching out to adults. So thousands of people have actually been exposed to what the environment is and what their responsibility for the environment is. Again, we have standards and guidelines. We have the open access to resources, EE Pro. Anybody can go on EE Pro and find what they need. And if they can't find it, then you can put out a request. Does anybody know if there's any resources on teaching about X? And you'll get a response, and you'll probably get a global response because people are doing a lot of things in a lot of different countries. EE obviously being done not only at the national level, global national level, all the way down to the local level. That last one, EE Works, is a project that we're working on through this program that's actually looking at how can I show that environmental education actually leads to improved environment? If I am using environmental education as a tool in our toolbox to achieve environmental protection goals, we're actually finding research that says it does. It actually does work. People who learn about the environment are actually getting involved with helping protect their environment within their communities. Does environmental education lead to student achievement? Yes, it does. When you use education or environmental education as that integrating context for learning, so if I'm in an English class, I'm learning English, but I'm also reading Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It's the background, it's the integrating context for all learning, and yes, that does lead to higher achievement levels for students who actually do environmental education. It's stuck again. And there you go. Those are environmental educators. This is actually a leadership clinic that happened a year ago. These are folks, these are state affiliates. They are at the state level, boots on the ground people doing environmental education. This is not about teaching them how to be better teachers or to teach the content. This is about helping them become leaders in their states, helping them learn how to communicate better, how to help diversify the field of environmental education, how to fundraise, how do you go out and get money for your association so you can continue to do the stuff you want to do. That all of that, that's who those folks are doing that. Thanks. Sorry for a second, I think this is now the... So let me talk, before I start talking about the next one, let me talk a little bit about sort of the problems we have with this one. When I started thinking about, okay, this is 1990, I think there's a whole bunch of people in this room who were probably not born in 1990 and don't realize that internet, not so much. Cell phones, yeah, cell phones were the size of a shoebox. They're not what we have today. Things were very, very different. There was no social media. Nobody understood what social media was or have that as a way of communication. Everything has changed. And I'm stuck with a law that doesn't allow for the kind of open opportunities that are out there using social media to help get kids engaged, to help get teenagers, to help get college students really, really engaged in environmental education. Too prescriptive, like I said, 25% for the educator training program. Doesn't allow me to take advantage of opportunities that may be out there, that if we put a little more money here, we may be able to get something out of there. We can't do anything about that. There is no permanent funding source. One of the most important aspects of the law in Taiwan is that they have a permanent funding source. They take a percentage of environmental funds and they use that for environmental education. We've talked about that in our country for a very long time. That's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. So how do we really go out and start looking for solid sources of funding, either federally or at the state level or at the local level, or even talking about private sector? When you don't have enough funds, or you're like us where we don't know if we're going to get money every year because somebody on the outside is helping us get money, they're the ones who are going to Congress and saying, this is really important, you guys need to put money into this law. Doesn't it really allow for any strategic planning? Because you can't really think about 5-10 years out where you want to be if you don't know you're going to have money or not. So that has really impacted, I think, what we could have been able to do if we had had money. There's no discussion whatsoever about research and evaluation. Research is fundamental to our work. Everything that we do has to be research-based, and we have to be able to translate that research for practitioners. So if you're a teacher standing there reading an article and going, I have no idea what this means for me, we need to help people translate that research so that they can see how it will help them improve their practice. I had a very long conversation with Judy Brous, who is the executive director of the North American Association for Environmental Education, and it was like, well, if we could, write another law, what would we want to do? The first thing I said, well, what kind of world do we want? Right now, I never thought that having a science-informed society that I had to say that, but where we are right now, yep, I have to say that. The same with a more equitable society. We are, in the United States, our majority is going to become a minority within the next 20 years. We have not done a very good job of helping to diversify the country and helping people to treat each other more equitably. We want people to have a very, very strong environmental ethic. That's only going to happen if environmental education is part of the system of education in the United States. Right now, it is not. Again, not supposed to be talking about climate change, but the reality is climate change is an issue for everyone in every country, and we have to be prepared for it. As citizens of our country and as global citizens, we have to understand what is climate change, what is global warming, and what are we supposed to be doing to fix it. And again, the last is, we want the best and the brightest people working and caring about the environment, caring about how do we protect human health and the environment. We want people who are actually working on those problems, being innovative, being creative. How do we get more people involved in environmental protection than are now? Education, environmental education has to be a priority in our country. Right now, because of our system, there is a ministry of education. They do not make the rules for education in the country. Every state is doing its own thing. So some of them have environmental education as a requirement, some of them do not. So we have to, with a priority in our country on English and math, what we're saying is that if you focus environmental education, it will improve your English scores, it will improve your math scores, and it will help people with those developing critical thinking, problem solving, decision making skills. That's what, as environmental educators, that's what we know. We've got to help people in the future, and we have to look at workforce development issues. As we're moving away from the manufacturing sector into the information sector, again, we have to have people who are really focused on wanting to protect the environment, want to protect human health. In our country, there's still this mindset that, well, the government will do it. The Environmental Protection Agencies, that's why EPA is there, because their job is to protect human health and the environment. Well, they've done such a good job with that, you've now shifted the sources of pollution in our country. Individuals, households, small and medium-sized industries. You can't regulate them. The only thing you can do is help educate. And in our country, we don't do sustainability. We don't understand the Sustainable Development Goals. We don't, it's not taught anywhere. Even though SDG 4 is about education, there is no conversation currently about how do you really bring us in line with the rest of the world who's all looking at the SDGs. We're not doing that. So the next law, we have to be talking about systemic change. Honestly, at 8.7 or 8.9 or even $10 million a year, you're not going to get to systemic change. It's not possible. We're still in the, what I call the 10 people in the canoe. The 10 people in the canoe are doing something and that's great for them, but what about everybody else? You cannot get to systemic change where we are now. The concept of bigger audiences, my biggest complaint about environmental educators in the United States is we're really, really, really good at talking to ourselves. We're not very good at talking to the rest of the world. So we'll put articles in the journals for environmental education and the research journals, but where are we talking into the major newspapers around the world, the major news sources around the world? We have to start talking to the rest of the world, not just to ourselves. The new partnerships, when we started talking about, I had a conversation with a group of students, and I said, how many of you, if you owned an NGO, how many of you would take money from Exxon or BP? If they were going to give you $10 million, $100 million for you to do environmental education, would you take money from them? In the room, probably half of them would and half of them wouldn't. Bottom line is the private sector is where a lot of the pollution is coming from. So if we are not involving them in the conversation, then we're not going to get very far. Especially in this part of the world, we're even talking about circular economy because technology is a big issue in this part of the world. Technology companies are already there. Any kid knows, here's my iPhone, I don't throw it away, I turn it back in. And Apple or Samsung or Sony will take that phone, take it apart, and use all the materials. That kind of thinking we have to have in every sector, in every country, globally. That's what I mean by reaching out for new partners. The next act, yes, we have to talk about research and development, no question. A lot of funds need to be going to that. We don't have them. We have to start looking at developing more resources. One of the biggest complaints is there's not enough curriculum or climate change curriculum out there. Somebody's got to start doing that. We have to start helping people evaluate their programs at all levels. We need to really focus on the community. This has always been sort of the grassroots, ground up. There's a few of us working at this level, but most of it's happening there. That has to continue, but we also have to have people looking at it from a systemic level. The states are now required with the with the passage of the Primary and Secondary Act, they're now required to have environmental literacy plans. 47 out of the 50 states are now working on those. That should be incorporated in a new piece of legislation. Again, EE and ESD, right now in our country, we have this, we can't talk about sustainability, we can't talk about environmental education, we can't even talk about how you put those two things together, because they're really not that different. And again, climate change, education, and like I said, public-private partnerships. So I don't think we're doing questions right now, but there's an awful lot that is happening in the United States as part of this piece of legislation, but it really is time for us to step back and look at where we go from here, and that's what we're beginning to do. And I'm really interested in hearing from you guys, hearing some of the ideas you might have of what you think a national level environmental education law should look like. Thank you.